What happens when everything you've worked for, your dreams, your career, your future, gets ripped away in a single moment? When one false move changes your life forever? Chris Johnson had one goal: to prove he was the fastest. But instead, he found himself fighting a system that wanted to silence him. Accused. Arrested. His name dragged through the mud. But Chris wasn't just another athlete. He became a symbol for something much bigger. This is a story about resilience, a fight for justice, and a race for more than just gold. Will he rise above it all? Or will the system break him? You're about to find out. The sun had just begun to rise over the city, casting long shadows across the empty streets of a wealthy neighborhood. The air was cool, with a slight breeze carrying the fresh scent of early morning dew. Chris Johnson, a young track star in his mid-20s, was finishing up his morning run. His footsteps were steady, rhythmic, pounding against the paved path of Maplewood Park, where he had trained for years. The city was just starting to stir, and Chris relished these quiet moments before the chaos of the day set in. Dressed in a simple gray hoodie and running shorts, Chris was laser-focused. His mind replayed the mantra that had gotten him through countless races: breathe, push, believe. This run was just another step toward his goal, a gold medal at the upcoming National Track Championships. It was everything he'd worked for. A chance not only to prove himself but also to rise above the humble beginnings in Brooklyn, where opportunities like this were rare. As Chris rounded the corner, the familiar weight of his backpack bounced lightly against his shoulders. Inside were his water bottle, towel, and a pair of fresh sneakers for his next practice. He slowed to a walk, catching his breath while admiring the quiet beauty of the park. The leaves rustled gently in the breeze, and a couple of joggers passed him, nodding their morning greetings. Chris smiled to himself, the anticipation of the day ahead filling him with a renewed sense of energy. Just as he approached the bench where he usually stretched, he noticed something unusual. 2 police officers, both tall and serious-looking, were walking in his direction. Chris felt a knot form in his stomach but pushed the feeling aside. Officer Parker and Officer Jennings had expressions that didn't match the calm of the morning. They were watching him intently, their gazes fixed on him like they were sizing him up. Chris had lived in the city long enough to know the look, one that told him trouble might be brewing. He wasn't doing anything wrong, of course. He was just another runner in the park, someone training for greatness. Yet the way the officers moved closer made his muscles tense. "Excuse me, sir," one of them called out, his voice carrying over the sound of rustling trees. Chris turned toward them, still catching his breath from the run. "Yes, officer?" Chris asked, his voice calm but cautious. He could feel the weight of their stares as they sized him up. "Can we see some ID?" Officer Parker asked, his tone flat and authoritative. There was no greeting, no explanation. Just a demand. Chris raised an eyebrow, confused. "I'm sorry, but is there a problem?" he replied, keeping his voice level. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," Officer Jennings added, his hand resting too comfortably on his belt, close to the holster. Chris felt a flicker of annoyance but kept his composure. He'd been in situations like this before. As a young black man, especially in a neighborhood like this, he knew that sometimes just existing made him a suspect. His father had warned him about moments like this. Stay calm, keep your head down, and don't give them any reason to escalate things. Suspicious activity? I'm just finishing my run, Chris said, trying to keep the tension out of his voice. He slowly reached for his wallet, knowing that any sudden move could lead to something worse. He handed over his ID, glancing between the 2 officers. Parker looked over the ID, his expression unreadable. "What brings you to this neighborhood?" he asked, his tone a bit too accusatory for Chris's liking. "I'm training," Chris replied simply, nodding toward the park behind him. "I've been coming here for years." Jennings, still silent, took a step forward. His eyes were hard, scanning Chris like he was looking for an excuse to find something wrong. "And what kind of training do you do?" he asked, almost mockingly. "I'm a sprinter," Chris said, keeping his responses short. He wanted this to end as soon as possible, to get back to his routine without any more trouble. Parker handed the ID back but didn't step away. "A sprinter, huh? You don't see too many sprinters around here." Chris felt the tension in the air thicken. He knew where this was going. It wasn't about the ID or the training. It was about the fact that he was black, in a wealthy neighborhood, and they couldn't reconcile that with their assumptions. He had seen it happen too many times before. "If there's nothing else, officers, I'd like to get back to my training," Chris said, forcing a polite smile. He hoped that keeping things civil would de-escalate the situation. But Parker didn't move. "We're going to need you to step over here for a moment," he said, his hand now resting on Chris's arm. Chris's heart raced. He wasn't sure how this had escalated so quickly, but he knew he had to be careful. His career, his dreams, everything could be jeopardized in an instant if this went wrong. "Why?" Chris asked, pulling his arm away gently. "I haven't done anything wrong." Jennings stepped forward, his tone hardening. "Just cooperate, all right? You don't want to make this worse." The weight of their authority pressed down on Chris, and for a moment, he considered resisting, telling them off, standing his ground. But his father's voice echoed in his head again. "Stay calm, keep your head down." "Fine," Chris said, stepping away from the bench. "But I'm telling you, I haven't done anything wrong." Parker's grip on his arm tightened suddenly, pulling it behind his back before Chris had a chance to react. Pain shot through his shoulder as he was shoved to the ground, his chest hitting the cold concrete. "Hey!" Chris shouted, his voice cracking with frustration. "What are you doing?" "You're under arrest for resisting," Parker said coldly, snapping the cuffs onto Chris's wrists. His heart pounded in his chest, disbelief and anger flooding his mind. He hadn't resisted at all, he'd done everything they asked. Around him, the park was still quiet, but a few onlookers had stopped, their faces painted with shock and confusion. Someone pulled out a phone and started recording. Chris's mind raced. He had seen this play out before. He knew what could happen next if he wasn't careful. As the officers hauled him to his feet, Chris could barely comprehend what was happening. He had come here to train, to focus on his future, but now he was being dragged toward a police car, his wrists bound behind him like he was a criminal. He turned his head, catching the eyes of a woman recording the incident. For a split second, he felt a spark of hope. Maybe this footage would help him later. Maybe this wasn't over yet. But for now, all he could do was keep his head down, keep breathing, and hope that this nightmare would end soon. The cold, metallic clink of the handcuffs bit into Chris's wrists as the police car pulled away from Maplewood Park. His thoughts raced as the city streets blurred past him. What had just happened? 1 minute he was training for the biggest competition of his life, and the next he was locked in the back of a squad car. The officers, Parker and Jennings, sat in the front seat, silently ignoring the confused murmurs coming from Chris. His heart pounded as the reality of the situation settled in. His mind flashed back to the countless conversations he'd had with his dad, preparing him for moments like this. "Stay calm, don't fight back, don't give them a reason to hurt you." But no amount of advice could have prepared him for the raw humiliation and anger surging through him now. The car came to a halt outside a gray, nondescript police station in the heart of the city. The station seemed even more cold and uninviting as Parker roughly opened the car door and yanked Chris out. His muscles were tense, not from training this time, but from fear. As they led him inside, he tried to keep his breathing steady, reminding himself that he hadn't done anything wrong. The booking area was a stark contrast to the bustling streets outside. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting a sterile glow over the room. Officers moved about, focused on paperwork, barely glancing in his direction. Chris was ushered into a small room where a tired-looking officer sat behind a desk, not even bothering to look up. "Name," the officer mumbled, fingers poised over a keyboard. "Chris Johnson," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The officer typed his name into the system, his eyes scanning the screen for a moment. He frowned but didn't say anything. He motioned toward another officer, who led Chris to the fingerprinting station. Chris's mind raced. How had this escalated so quickly? He wasn't a criminal. He was an athlete, someone who had trained his entire life for a shot at greatness. And now here he was, being treated like he had done something wrong. After being fingerprinted, Chris was led to a holding cell in the back of the station. The cell was small, barely enough room for the narrow bench that lined one wall. The air smelled like disinfectant and something sour that Chris couldn't quite place. The clang of the cell door closing behind him felt like the final blow. He sat down, staring at the cold concrete floor, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Hours passed, though it felt like days. He kept replaying the moment in the park, wondering if he had done something wrong. Should he have been more compliant? Should he have just stayed silent? But deep down, Chris knew it wasn't his fault. It never was in situations like this. He was just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time, doing nothing but existing. The clamor of keys and the sound of the cell door opening jolted Chris out of his thoughts. An officer motioned for him to get up. "Your lawyer's here," the officer said, almost sounding bored. Chris stood, his legs stiff from sitting in the cramped cell for so long. He was led down a narrow hallway to a small, dimly lit room. As he stepped inside, a wave of relief washed over him when he saw his lawyer, James Lawrence, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a look of determination etched on his face. James was more than just a lawyer. He was someone Chris's family had known for years. He had represented other young men from their neighborhood, fighting against similar injustices. If anyone could get Chris out of this nightmare, it was him. "Chris," James said, standing as Chris entered the room. His voice was calm, but there was a fire behind his eyes. "Sit down. We need to talk." Chris sat, his body still humming with a mix of anger and confusion. He could barely get the words out. "James, what's happening? I didn't do anything. I was just running. Why did they arrest me?" James leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "I know, Chris. This is a clear case of racial profiling. Unfortunately, this happens all the time, especially in neighborhoods like the one you were in." He paused, his expression hardening. "But we're going to fight this. I've already started the process of getting you out of here. I've spoken to the officers, but they're sticking to their story. They claim you were acting suspiciously and resisted arrest." Chris scoffed, disbelief washing over him. "Resisted arrest? I didn't resist anything. I did everything they asked." James nodded, understanding. "That's what they always say in cases like this. But listen to me, Chris, we're going to get through this. Right now, I need you to stay focused. We're going to get you out of here, but it's not going to be easy. They're going to try to spin this however they can." Chris clenched his fists, the frustration boiling inside him. "This isn't fair, James. I have the biggest competition of my life coming up, and now this? What if I lose everything because of this?" James sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I know it's not fair, Chris. None of this is. But right now you need to focus on clearing your name. I've got people working on this, and we'll have you out of here before the competition. But you have to stay calm. I need you to trust me." Chris looked down at his hands, his mind still spinning. He wanted to believe James, but the fear of losing everything he had worked for gnawed at him. He had always known that being black in America came with challenges, but now, sitting in that cold room, the weight of it felt crushing. James stood up, gathering his papers. "I'm going to file the paperwork now to get you released. In the meantime, try to rest. I know it's hard, but we're going to fight this. Chris nodded numbly, watching as James left the room. Alone again, he let out a long breath. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to him. Not when he was so close to achieving his dreams. He had worked too hard, come too far, to have everything ripped away because of a moment of prejudice and ignorance. Back in the holding cell, the minutes ticked by slowly. The ache in Chris's chest deepened as the hours passed. His thoughts drifted to his family, especially his dad, who had always told him to be prepared for moments like this, but who could never have prepared him for how it would actually feel. The injustice of it all felt suffocating. Then came the sound of a key in the lock again. The officer from earlier opened the door and motioned for Chris to follow. But the reality was, the system wasn't built for people like him. It never had been. Maya gently pulled him away from the window. Come on. Let's at least try to get some sleep. You've got practice tomorrow. Chris nodded, though sleep felt like the farthest thing from his mind. But Maya was right. He had practice tomorrow, and if he was going to survive this, if he was going to reclaim his life, he had to stay focused. The competition was just days away, and for now, that had to be enough. The next morning, Chris stood on the track at Washington High Stadium, the cool air hitting his face as he adjusted his spikes. The familiar hum of early morning practice surrounded him, teammates stretching, runners warming up, the low murmur of coaches exchanging quiet words. But for Chris, the normalcy felt hollow, like a distant echo of what his routine used to be. The weight of the previous day's events clung to him like a fog he couldn't shake. Coach Robert stood a few feet away, watching him closely. He could sense that Chris wasn't fully present. The tightness in his body language, the way he avoided eye contact, it was clear that yesterday's arrest had taken its toll. Robert knew that Chris needed to get his mind back in the game, but it was easier said than done. All right, let's do some 400s today. Robert called out to the group, his voice firm but encouraging. Push yourselves, but stay controlled. Chris nodded numbly, stepping onto the starting line. His muscles twitched, ready for the familiar surge of energy that came with running. But as he set his feet, his mind wandered back to the police station. The cuffs digging into his wrists, the cold concrete of the holding cell, the looks of doubt from everyone who saw him. He tried to shake it off, to focus on the track ahead, but it was like a shadow following him everywhere he went. The whistle blew, and Chris took off, his feet pounding the ground in perfect rhythm. The familiar rush of wind filled his ears as he pushed himself down the straightaway, but his thoughts wouldn't quiet. Every step felt heavier than usual, weighed down by the uncertainty of his future. By the time he crossed the finish line, his breath was ragged. He bent over, hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. He had run slower than usual. He could feel it. Robert walked over, his expression unreadable. You're not yourself today, Chris. Chris shook his head, straightening up. I know. I can't stop thinking about everything that happened. It's like I'm running with a weight on my back. Robert placed a hand on his shoulder. I get it, but you can't let this derail you. This race is everything, Chris. You need to focus. Chris clenched his fists, frustration boiling beneath the surface. How am I supposed to focus when they're trying to ruin everything I've worked for? My name is all over the news. People are saying things, sponsors are already pulling out. What if they don't even let me compete? Robert's face tightened, but his voice remained calm. Listen to me. Right now, the only thing you can control is what happens on this track. Everything else, what people say, what happens with the charges, we'll deal with that. But if you let this take over your mind, you're letting them win. You're letting them take away your chance before the race even starts. Chris swallowed hard. He knew Robert was right, but it didn't make it any easier. The fear of losing everything still gripped him, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. As Chris walked back to the bench, Maya was waiting on the sidelines, her eyes full of empathy. She had come to support him at practice, like she always did, but today felt different. There was a tension between them, unspoken but undeniable. Maya had been trying to stay strong, but Chris could see the worry in her eyes. "You're pushing too hard," she said gently as he sat down. "You need to give yourself some time to process all of this." Chris shook his head. "I don't have time, Maya. The competition is in a few days. If I don't get my head straight, I'll lose everything." Maya sighed, sitting beside him. "I know this isn't fair, Chris. What they did to you was wrong. But you can't carry all of this on your shoulders alone. We're here for you, Robert, James, me. You don't have to go through this by yourself." Chris stared at the ground, his mind still racing. He appreciated Maya's support, but it didn't change the fact that he felt completely isolated in this moment. No one else could truly understand the weight he was carrying. "I'm just trying to figure out how to get past this," he muttered. "How do I move forward when everything feels like it's falling apart?" Maya took his hand, squeezing it gently. "By focusing on what's important. You've always been able to push through the hardest things. This is no different. You're not alone, Chris. We'll get through this." Her words offered some comfort, but Chris's mind remained clouded with doubt. He knew that support from his loved ones was crucial, but it was hard to shake the feeling that this was a battle he had to fight on his own. No one could step onto that track and run for him. No one could restore his reputation but him. As the day went on, the atmosphere around him started to shift. Word of his arrest had spread quickly, and it wasn't just his teammates who were talking. Across the city, support for Chris was growing. On social media, hashtags like #JusticeForChris and #LetHimRun were trending. Activists and public figures began speaking out, demanding that the charges against him be dropped. At first, Chris hadn't paid much attention to the online chatter, but as he scrolled through his phone later that night, he saw messages of support flooding his notifications. People he didn't even know were rallying behind him, sharing his story, calling out the injustice. It was both overwhelming and humbling. He saw one post from an athlete he admired, someone who had faced discrimination in their career as well. "Stay strong, Chris. We've got your back. #LetHimRun." Chris stared at the screen, feeling a strange mix of hope and frustration. On one hand, it was incredible to see so many people coming to his defense. On the other, it reminded him that this fight was now bigger than just his race. It was about something much deeper, about proving that he, and others like him, didn't deserve to be treated like criminals for simply existing. The next day at practice, more reporters showed up. Camera crews lined the perimeter of the track, snapping photos and shouting questions at him every time he took a break. Chris tried to tune them out, but their presence was inescapable. They wanted a story, and his arrest had given them one. "Ignore them," Robert said sternly as Chris laced up his shoes. "Focus on the race." Chris nodded, but it was easier said than done. Every step on the track felt like it carried more weight now. It wasn't just about winning, it was about vindication, about showing the world that they couldn't hold him back, no matter what they tried to do. As he jogged around the field, Maya watched from the stands, her eyes tracking his every movement. She could see the pressure mounting on him, the way his strides were tight, less fluid than usual. She knew he was fighting an internal battle, one that she couldn't fight for him. After practice, Maya pulled him aside, her voice low but firm. "You need to let go of the fear, Chris. I know it's hard, but if you keep holding on to all this anger, it's going to break you." Chris ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "I'm trying. It's so much." Maya nodded, her expression softening. "I know. But you're stronger than this. You've been through worse, and you've come out on top every time. This isn't the end." Chris wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that he could push through, that this wouldn't define him. But the uncertainty lingered, like a dark cloud over everything he did. The race was coming, and with it, the chance to reclaim his future, or lose it entirely. The day had started like any other since the arrest, heavy with doubt and anxiety. Chris stood in the locker room after practice, towel draped around his shoulders, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The tension in his muscles seemed permanent now, like it had taken up residence in his body, refusing to leave. He tried to shake it off, but the weight of the upcoming race and the charges still hanging over him made every movement feel sluggish, every thought a battle. He grabbed his phone from the bench, intending to scroll through messages from his lawyer, James, and the few sponsors that hadn't pulled out yet. But instead, his screen was flooded with notifications. Social media mentions, messages, missed calls. Chris's heart raced as he saw the same headline repeated across multiple platforms. Asterisk. Video evidence clears athlete Chris Johnson, the truth about the arrest. Asterisk. His breath caught in his throat as he tapped the first link. A news article appeared, accompanied by a shaky but clear video of the moment he was arrested in the park. It showed him complying with the officers, his hands raised in submission, his voice calm as he asked what was going on. There was no sign of aggression or resistance, no indication that he had done anything wrong. The video zoomed in on the officers, especially Parker, who was smirking as he twisted Chris's arm behind his back and forced him to the ground. Chris stared at the screen, frozen. The headline blurred as tears pricked the corners of his eyes. Someone had recorded the whole thing. Someone had caught the moment that had turned his world upside down. It was proof, solid, undeniable proof, that he had been wrongfully arrested. His phone buzzed again, this time a call from James. Chris answered quickly, his voice shaking. "James, did you see it?" "I saw it," James replied, his voice steady but urgent. "This changes everything, Chris. The video is going viral. We have multiple angles from different witnesses, all showing the same thing: you did nothing wrong." Chris collapsed onto the bench, the weight in his chest finally beginning to lift. "What does this mean? Can they still press charges?" "No," James said firmly. "With this evidence, the charges won't hold up. I'm working on getting them dropped as we speak. This could also open up the possibility for a civil case against the department for wrongful arrest." Chris rubbed his forehead, trying to take it all in. It felt like the first real breath of relief he had taken since the nightmare began. "What happens now?" "Now we wait for the official word," James continued. "But Chris, I need you to understand that while this is a huge win, it doesn't mean the fight is over. We still have to handle the media, the sponsors, and the public perception. This is going to be a long road, but this video gives us the upper hand." Chris nodded, though James couldn't see him. "Thank you, James. I don't know what I would have done without you." "We're not done yet," James replied. "Stay focused on your race. I'll handle the rest." After they hung up, Chris sat in silence for a few minutes, his mind processing everything. He had been vindicated. The truth was out there, and the world was seeing it. But as James had said, the fight wasn't over. He still had to rebuild his reputation, his career, and his focus for the race just days away. Maya appeared in the doorway, her expression cautious but hopeful. "I saw the news," she said softly. "It's incredible." Chris looked up at her, his heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion. "Yeah. I can't believe it." Maya sat down next to him on the bench, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. "I knew the truth would come out. It always does." Chris leaned into her embrace, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of her support ease some of the tension in his body. "I just hope it's enough," he murmured. "I need to run this race, Maya. It's the only way I can prove to myself that they didn't take everything from me." She pulled back slightly, looking him in the eyes. You've already proven that, Chris. But I get it. This race, it's more than just a competition now. It's about showing them that no matter what they throw at you, you'll keep going. Chris nodded, the determination slowly creeping back into his veins. The video had given him a chance to reclaim his story. But the race was where he would solidify his redemption. Winning would mean everything. It would be the final statement, the final defiance against the system that had tried to break him. Later that evening, as Chris scrolled through social media, he saw the outpouring of support growing by the minute. Athletes, celebrities, and activists were sharing the video, calling out the injustice and demanding accountability from the police department. The hashtag Justice for Chris was trending worldwide. Messages of encouragement flooded his inbox, with people telling him to stay strong, to keep fighting. Among the comments, one stood out to him, asterisk. Run for all of us, Chris. Show them what you're made of. Asterisk, the words struck a chord deep inside him. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about everyone who had been in his shoes, everyone who had been wrongly accused, beaten down, or silenced. This race was his chance to show the world that he wouldn't be defined by the injustice he had suffered. As the night wore on, Chris felt a new sense of purpose. The video had cleared his name, but the real victory would come on the track. That's where he would show the world what he was truly made of. The next morning, Chris arrived at the track for practice with a renewed energy. The air felt different, lighter somehow. Coach Robert noticed it too. You seem better today, he said, handing Chris a stopwatch. Heard the news? Chris nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. Yeah. It feels like a weight's been lifted. Robert clapped him on the shoulder. Good. Now let's get back to work. You've got a race to win. Chris stepped onto the track, the familiar sensation of adrenaline pulsing through him as he took his position. This time, there was no heaviness, no shadow of doubt hanging over him. The truth was out, and now, it was up to him to finish what he had started. As he pushed off from the starting line, his feet hitting the ground in perfect rhythm, Chris felt something he hadn't felt in weeks: freedom. The day of the National Track Championships had finally arrived. The stadium was buzzing with energy, filled with the chatter of excited spectators and the sound of athletes warming up on the field. The atmosphere was electric, but for Chris, it was something else entirely. This race was more than just about winning. It was about reclaiming his life. He stood near the starting blocks, his eyes scanning the stadium. The last few days had been a whirlwind. The charges against him were officially dropped, thanks to the viral video, and public support had only grown stronger. But now, all that attention felt like a double-edged sword. He had to prove himself, not just as a runner, but as someone who could overcome everything that had been thrown at him. This was his moment to show that he couldn't be broken. Maya was in the stands watching him closely, her face a mixture of pride and worry. Chris had seen that look before. She knew how much this race meant to him, how much was riding on his performance today. Next to her, Coach Robert sat with his arms crossed, his eyes never leaving Chris. He had coached Chris through years of ups and downs, but this was different. Robert knew that Chris's career, reputation, and sense of self were all tied to what happened on this track today. Chris took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly as he stretched his legs. He couldn't let the pressure get to him. He had trained for this moment for years. This wasn't the time to doubt himself. He had already come too far, and he wasn't about to let fear win now. His competitors began to line up, each of them focused, their faces set with determination. Chris had raced against some of these men before, but today, the stakes felt higher. Everyone was watching him. The media had been relentless in their coverage of his arrest and the subsequent fallout, and now they were waiting to see if he could live up to the story they had built around him. As he adjusted his spikes, Chris felt a familiar surge of adrenaline. He had always loved this feeling, the calm before the storm, the brief moment of silence before the gun went off. But today, it felt different. His mind wasn't just on the race. It was on everything that had led up to this moment. The arrest, the video, the public support. It all felt like it was building towards something bigger than a 400-meter dash. Suddenly, a voice broke through his thoughts. "Chris Johnson, over here!" Chris looked up to see a reporter with a camera crew rushing toward him. He had been trying to avoid the media all morning, but there was no escaping it now. "How do you feel, Chris? Ready for the big race?" the reporter asked, shoving the microphone toward his face. Chris forced a smile, though his nerves were still raw. "Yeah, I'm ready," he said, keeping his response short. He didn't want to get distracted, but he knew the media was part of this story now. He had to play along, at least for a moment. "Any thoughts on the controversy surrounding your arrest?" the reporter pressed, clearly fishing for a headline. Chris clenched his jaw, but he kept his tone measured. "I'm focused on the race. That's all that matters right now." The reporter nodded, but Chris could tell she wasn't satisfied. She wanted a story, something dramatic to put in the headlines. But Chris wasn't going to give it to her. Not today. He turned away from the cameras, heading toward the starting line. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the blocks. This was it. The moment he had been working for his entire life. Everything else faded into the background as he settled into his stance, his body coiled like a spring, ready to explode the moment the gun fired. The crowd grew silent as the athletes took their positions. Chris's heart beat loudly in his ears, but he focused on his breathing, calming his mind. He could feel the weight of every eye on him, but he pushed the pressure aside. This race was about him, his journey, and the victory he deserved. The starter's pistol cracked through the air, and Chris shot off the blocks like lightning, his legs pumping with precision and power. The roar of the crowd was deafening, but Chris didn't hear it. All he could focus on was the track ahead, the rhythm of his breath, the surge of adrenaline that propelled him forward. He rounded the first curve, his body moving like a machine, every muscle working in perfect harmony. But as he pushed down the backstretch, his mind wandered back to the events of the last few weeks. The arrest, the police station, the uncertainty. For a brief moment, he felt the weight of it all trying to drag him down, but he shook it off. This wasn't the time for doubt. He had to push through. By the time he hit the final curve, Chris could feel the burn in his legs, the familiar ache of exhaustion setting in. But he didn't slow down. He couldn't. This was his race, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it from him. As he powered down the final stretch, he could hear the crowd on their feet, cheering, shouting his name. His competitors were closing in, but Chris pushed harder, his body screaming for relief, his lungs burning with every breath. With one final burst of energy, Chris crossed the finish line, his chest heaving as he stumbled forward. He bent over, hands on his knees, gasping for air, his body shaking from the effort. The crowd erupted into cheers, and for a moment, Chris couldn't believe it was real. He had done it. He had won. Reporters rushed toward him, cameras flashing, microphones shoved in his face. But Chris barely registered them. He was still catching his breath, still processing what had just happened. Maya appeared at the edge of the track, her face glowing with pride as she watched him, her eyes full of love and relief. Coach Robert was next to her, nodding with approval, a rare smile on his face. Chris straightened up, his chest still heaving, as a reporter pushed a microphone toward him. "Chris, how does it feel to win after everything you've been through?" Chris wiped the sweat from his brow, his mind still spinning from the race. But as he stood there, under the bright stadium lights, something clicked. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about everyone who had been in his shoes, everyone who had faced injustice and fought back. He took a deep breath, his voice steady as he spoke. "This victory isn't just for me. It's for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong. It's for everyone who's ever had to fight just to be seen, to be heard. This is for all of us." The reporter blinked, taken aback, but the crowd responded with thunderous applause, chanting his name. Chris looked out at the sea of faces, feeling the weight of his words settle over him. This race had been about more than a medal. It had been about proving that no matter what they threw at him, no matter how hard they tried to tear him down, he would rise. As the stadium lights shone down on him, Chris realized that this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he had won. The roar of the crowd was still echoing in Chris's ears as he made his way off the track, the weight of the victory settling into his bones. Sweat clung to his skin, and his legs trembled from the effort, but the rush of adrenaline carried him through the moment. This wasn't just any win, it was a statement. Maya reached him first, throwing her arms around his neck in a tight embrace. "You did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You really did it." Chris hugged her back, still breathless. The noise of the stadium was deafening, but all he could focus on was the relief flooding through him. For the first time in what felt like forever, he could breathe. Coach Robert joined them, a rare smile spreading across his usually stern face. "Hell of a race, Chris," he said, patting him on the back. "I knew you had it in you." Chris nodded, still catching his breath. "Thanks, Coach. I couldn't have done it without you." As they stood there, basking in the moment, a throng of reporters and camera crews began to swarm around them, eager to capture every word, every reaction. The race had been huge, but Chris's story, the arrest, the controversy, the victory, had turned it into something bigger. They wanted his reaction. They wanted to know what this win meant after everything he had been through. Chris knew he couldn't avoid them. This was part of it now. His story had become a public narrative, and he had to face it head on. But this time, he was ready. He turned toward the cameras, taking a deep breath as they shoved microphones in his face. The questions came all at once. "Chris, how does it feel to win after everything that's happened? What's your message to the people who doubted you? Do you have anything to say about the charges that were dropped?" Chris held up a hand, signaling for quiet. The cameras zoomed in, the reporters leaning in closer, waiting for his response. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but instead of fear, there was a calmness, a sense of purpose. This was his chance to speak, and he wasn't going to waste it. "This win," he began, his voice steady despite the chaos around him, "isn't just for me. It's for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong, for everyone who's been judged because of the way they look, where they come from, or the color of their skin." The crowd around him quieted as he spoke, the weight of his words cutting through the noise. Chris's eyes scanned the sea of faces, taking in the mix of emotions, pride, anger, hope. This victory was personal, but it was also bigger than that. "I've spent my whole life running," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "Not just on the track, but running from the expectations and assumptions people have about me. But today, I'm standing here to say that I won't run from it anymore. I won't let anyone tell me what I can or can't do. And neither should you." The applause started small but quickly grew, spreading through the crowd until the entire stadium seemed to be cheering. Chris paused, letting the moment sink in. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every word, every expression, but this wasn't for the media. This was for everyone who had been in his shoes. "I was arrested because of who I am, not because of anything I did," Chris said, his voice cutting through the applause. "That's the reality for too many people in this country. But that doesn't mean we give up. It doesn't mean we stop fighting." A few of the reporters exchanged glances, clearly taken aback by his candor. Chris wasn't just talking about his race anymore. He was talking about the system, the injustice that had put him in this position in the first place. "We need change," Chris continued, his eyes locking onto the cameras. And that change doesn't come from just one person. It comes from all of us standing up and demanding that we be treated with the respect and dignity we deserve. The crowd erupted again, and Chris could feel the energy pulsing through the stadium. His words weren't just about the race. They were about something much larger. He had won today, but the fight for justice wasn't over. It had only just begun. As the applause died down, Chris stepped away from the cameras, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. Maya was at his side again, squeezing his hand. "You were amazing," she said quietly. Chris smiled, feeling the weight of her support. "I couldn't have done it without you," he admitted. Coach Robert nodded, still standing by, though his expression had shifted from pride to something more somber. "This is a big moment, Chris," he said. "But you're right. This is just the beginning. There's a lot of work to do." Chris nodded, knowing his coach was right. The victory on the track was only one step. The real race, changing the system that had nearly destroyed his life, was far from over. As the media began to disperse and the crowd started to leave the stadium, Chris found himself standing at the edge of the track, looking out at the emptying seats. He had won, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just a small victory in a much larger battle. There were so many people who didn't get the chance to fight back, who didn't have the platform or the support to clear their name. "Chris, there's someone here to see you," Maya said, pulling him from his thoughts. Chris turned to see James Lawrence, his lawyer, walking toward him, a small smile on his face. "You looked good out there," James said, shaking his hand. "Thanks," Chris replied, still catching his breath from the speech as much as the race. James's smile faded slightly, his tone turning more serious. "I just wanted to let you know that we've filed the paperwork for a civil lawsuit against the department. With the video evidence and the public outcry, we've got a strong case." Chris nodded, feeling a surge of determination. "Good. They need to be held accountable." "They will be," James assured him. "But it's going to be a fight. The system doesn't change overnight." Chris met his lawyer's gaze, his expression hardening with resolve. "I'm ready for it," he said. "Whatever it takes." James smiled again, but there was a gravity behind it. "I know you are." As they talked, Chris could hear the faint sounds of chanting coming from outside the stadium. He turned toward the entrance and saw a group of protesters gathering, holding signs that read, "Justice for Chris," and asterisk, "End racial profiling." Asterisk. Chris felt a lump form in his throat as he watched them. These people had come out to support him, to stand with him in his fight for justice. It was humbling, but it was also a reminder of how much more work there was to do. Maya followed his gaze, her eyes soft with understanding. "They believe in you," she said quietly. "Just like I do." Chris nodded, taking her hand. "It's not just about me anymore," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's about all of us." Together, they walked toward the entrance of the stadium, where the protesters were gathered. As they approached, the crowd erupted in cheers, holding up their signs and chanting his name. Chris raised his hand in acknowledgement, feeling the weight of their support and the responsibility that came with it. This was more than just a victory on the track. It was the start of something bigger, something that would take time, effort, and perseverance. But Chris was ready for it. He had won the race today, but the fight for justice had only just begun. The days following the race were a blur of interviews, meetings, and unexpected attention. Chris had always dreamed of winning big competitions, but he had never imagined this level of scrutiny, both as an athlete and as a symbol for justice. His victory wasn't just a personal achievement anymore. It had become a flashpoint for discussions about racial profiling and the injustices faced by black men in America. Everywhere he went, people recognized him. Some congratulated him on the win, others thanked him for speaking out. But there were also whispers, people who questioned his motives, who said he was using the race as a platform to push a political agenda. Chris knew that no matter what he did, he couldn't please everyone. But that didn't stop the frustration from building. Sitting in his small apartment, Chris scrolled through social media. The support was overwhelming, but so were the critics. Some people still questioned whether the arrest had been justified, even with the video evidence. Others claimed he was capitalizing on his experience for fame. The internet was relentless, and Chris found it hard to shut out the negativity. "Don't let it get to you," Maya said from across the room, watching him as he scrolled through the endless comments. "You know what's true. That's all that matters." Chris looked up from his phone, his face tight with frustration. "It's hard, Maya. It feels like no matter what I do, people are going to twist it. I just wanted to run. Now it's like I'm carrying the weight of this whole thing on my back." Maya crossed the room, sitting beside him. She rested her hand on his arm, her eyes full of empathy. "You're not alone in this, Chris. I know it feels that way sometimes, but you have people who are behind you. You have me. You have Robert. And you have the whole community rallying around you." Chris nodded, but the weight of responsibility still hung heavy in the air. He had won the race, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was now out of his control. Every decision, every word he said, would be analyzed, dissected, and criticized. It was exhausting. Just then, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from his lawyer, James. "We need to meet," the text read. "Something important has come up." Chris's heart skipped a beat as he read the message. Important could mean a lot of things, but in this case, it almost certainly meant something to do with the lawsuit against the police department. "I've got to go meet with James," Chris said, standing up and grabbing his jacket. "He says something's come up." Maya looked concerned but nodded. "Let me know what happens." Chris kissed her on the forehead before heading out the door. The cool evening air hit his face as he stepped onto the street, his mind racing with possibilities. The lawsuit had been filed days ago, but this was the first time James had said something urgent had come up. When Chris arrived at James's office, the lawyer was waiting for him with a serious expression. "Chris, come in. We need to talk." Chris sat down across from him, his stomach in knots. "What's going on? Is something wrong with the case?" James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Not exactly. The case is moving forward, and we have a solid argument. But the city has responded. They're offering a settlement." Chris blinked, surprised. "A settlement? Already?" James nodded. "They're trying to avoid a drawn-out legal battle and more bad press. They know they're in a tough spot with the video evidence, and they'd rather pay you off than risk a public trial." Chris leaned back in his chair, trying to process what this meant. On one hand, a settlement would mean an immediate win, money, and a public acknowledgement that they had wronged him. But on the other hand, it wasn't justice. It wasn't real accountability. "How much are they offering?" Chris asked, his voice cautious. James hesitated. "A significant amount. Enough to make sure you're taken care of financially for a long time." Chris's mind raced. The money would be life-changing. He could focus entirely on his career without worrying about sponsorships, and he could help his family, too. But something about it felt wrong. It felt like the city was trying to buy his silence, to make the problem go away without facing the real consequences. "I don't know, James," Chris said slowly. "I didn't go through all of this just for money. I want them to be held accountable. I want real change." James nodded, his expression serious. "I understand, and that's your decision to make. But you should know that taking the settlement doesn't mean you're giving up on change. You can still speak out, still be a voice for justice. This settlement is just one part of the equation." Chris sat in silence for a moment, weighing his options. The settlement would bring some closure, but it wouldn't bring the kind of systemic change he wanted to see. He thought about the people who had rallied behind him, the protesters who had taken to the streets demanding justice not just for him, but for everyone who had faced the same injustice. "I need to think about it," Chris finally said, standing up. "This is a big decision." James nodded. "Take your time. But don't wait too long. The city wants this wrapped up quickly. As Chris left the office, his mind was still swirling with uncertainty. The money would solve a lot of his immediate problems, but it wouldn't fix the broken system. He knew that accepting the settlement would be the easy way out, but it might also mean giving up on the fight for real justice. When he returned home, Maya was waiting for him, her eyes full of questions. "What happened?" Chris sighed, sitting down beside her. "The city offered a settlement. A big one." Maya's eyebrows raised in surprise. "Already? What are you going to do?" "I don't know," Chris admitted. "The money would help, but it feels like they're trying to make this all go away without really fixing anything. I don't want to be another case they just sweep under the rug." Maya nodded, understanding. "I get it. But whatever you decide, I'll be here. This is your fight, Chris, but you don't have to go through it alone." Chris leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. The victory on the track had been clear and decisive, but this was murky. There were no easy answers, no simple solutions. He had to decide whether he wanted to take the win and move on, or keep fighting for something bigger, something that might take years to achieve. "I need to think," Chris said softly. "But whatever happens, I won't let them silence me. This is just the beginning." Maya squeezed his hand, her voice steady and calm. "I know. And whatever happens next, we'll face it together." The next morning, Chris woke up to the soft light of dawn streaming through the window. The weight of the decision still hung heavy in his mind, but there was a sense of clarity forming, like the fog of uncertainty was finally starting to lift. He had spent most of the night thinking about the settlement, weighing the pros and cons. The money could bring comfort and security, but it wasn't what he truly wanted. He hadn't fought through the arrest, the media storm, and the pressure of public scrutiny just for a check. This was about something bigger, something that couldn't be bought or silenced. Chris sat up in bed, the sheets falling away as he swung his legs over the edge. Maya stirred beside him, blinking sleepily. "You okay?" she asked, her voice still groggy with sleep. "Yeah," Chris said quietly. "I think I've made my decision." Maya sat up too, watching him closely. "What are you thinking?" Chris ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of his choice settle in. "I'm not going to take the settlement," he said firmly. "I don't want their money if it means they get to walk away without facing the consequences. This fight isn't about the money, it's about making sure this doesn't happen to someone else." Maya's face softened into a proud smile. "I knew you'd do the right thing." Chris stood up, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "I don't want to be another case that they brush aside. I want real accountability. If we go to trial, it might take longer, and it's going to be a fight, but it's the right thing to do." Maya got out of bed, walking over to him and wrapping her arms around his waist. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "I know this isn't easy, but you're standing up for something bigger than yourself." Chris hugged her tightly, feeling the warmth of her support. It was a comfort knowing that no matter how tough things got, he had someone by his side who believed in him, who understood why this fight mattered. Later that day, Chris met with James at his office to let him know the decision. "I'm not taking the settlement," Chris said as soon as he sat down. "I want to go to trial." James nodded, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I thought you might say that. It's a bold move, Chris. It's going to take time, and it's not going to be easy, but I think it's the right choice if you want real change." Chris leaned forward in his chair, his voice steady. "That's exactly what I want. I don't want this to just disappear. I want the city to be held accountable for what they did, and I want people to see that we're not just going to let this kind of thing slide." James pulled out a stack of papers and placed them on the desk in front of him. "Then we move forward. I'll start preparing the case for trial. We'll go after them with everything we've got." Chris exhaled, feeling a mixture of relief and determination. He had made his choice, and now there was no turning back. As the weeks passed, Chris threw himself into training with renewed energy. The case was still looming over him, but he refused to let it dominate his life. He had made peace with his decision, and now he was focused on the future, both as an athlete and as an advocate for justice. Coach Robert noticed a shift in Chris's attitude during practice. His strides were smoother, his focus sharper. It was as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, and he was finally able to run freely again. "You're looking strong, Chris," Robert said one afternoon as they wrapped up another intense training session. "Whatever you've been working through, it looks like you've found your groove again." Chris wiped the sweat from his brow, smiling at the compliment. "Yeah, I feel like I'm back. The case is still going, but I've made my decision. I'm not going to let it control me." Robert nodded, his respect for Chris evident in his eyes. "That's what I like to hear. Keep that focus. You've got a long road ahead of you, but you're on the right path." Chris nodded, grateful for the support. The race had been just one victory, but the battle for justice was ongoing. It would be a long fight, but Chris was ready for it. In the meantime, the community around him continued to rally. The hashtag Justice for Chris remained active on social media, and public pressure on the city grew. Activists and community leaders organized marches and forums, using Chris's case as a catalyst for broader discussions about police reform and racial justice. Chris attended one of these forums a few weeks later, standing in front of a packed community center alongside Maya, James, and several other activists. As he took the microphone, he felt the same sense of purpose that had driven him through the race. "This isn't just about me," Chris said, his voice carrying through the room. "It's about all of us. It's about standing up against a system that tries to silence us, that tries to make us believe we don't matter. But we do matter, and we're not going to stop fighting." The crowd erupted into applause, and Chris felt a swell of pride as he looked out at the faces of those who had supported him from the beginning. This fight was far from over, but together, they were making progress. Later that night, as Chris and Maya walked home through the quiet streets, Chris felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. The weight of the past few months was still there, but it wasn't as heavy anymore. He had made his decision, and now he was moving forward, step by step, day by day. As they reached their apartment, Maya turned to him, her eyes shining with pride. "You've come so far, Chris. And this is just the beginning." Chris smiled, pulling her close. "Yeah," he said softly. "Just the beginning." 6 months had passed since the race, and Chris found himself standing at the entrance of Washington High Stadium once again. But this time, everything felt different. The tension, the uncertainty, the fear that had once gripped him were gone. In its place was a sense of purpose, a knowledge that he had chosen the right path. The case against the city was ongoing, but Chris had remained steadfast in his decision to fight for justice. The lawsuit had gained national attention, with several other individuals coming forward to share their own experiences of wrongful arrests and racial profiling. What had started as a personal battle had grown into something much larger, something Chris hadn't anticipated but fully embraced. Today wasn't about courtrooms or legal battles, though. Today was about mentoring. Chris had been invited to speak to a group of young athletes, many of whom had been following his story since the beginning. For them, Chris wasn't just an athlete. He was a symbol of perseverance, of refusing to back down in the face of adversity. As he walked onto the field, he saw the group of teenagers standing in a circle, their faces a mix of awe and excitement. Some of them were already stretching, others whispering to each other as they spotted him. Coach Robert had been the one to arrange the meeting. He had always believed that Chris's story would resonate with young athletes, many of whom faced their own struggles, whether it be on the track or in life. "All right, listen up," Coach Robert called out to the group. "We've got a special guest here today, and I want you to give him your full attention. He's got something important to say." Chris smiled as he stepped forward, feeling the eyes of the young athletes on him. He could see pieces of himself in them, the same determination, the same drive to be the best. But he also saw the doubt, the fear of failing, the weight of expectations. "Hey everyone," Chris began, his voice calm and steady. "I know a lot of you know my story, and I won't spend too much time talking about the past. But what I do want to tell you is that, no matter what you're going through, no matter how hard things get, you can't let anyone or anything take away your focus." The athletes nodded, their attention locked on him. "I've been where you are," Chris continued. "I've had people tell me that I couldn't do it, that I didn't belong. And yeah, there were times when I believed them. Times when I thought maybe they were right. But what I learned through everything I've been through is that it doesn't matter what anyone else says. The only voice that matters is yours. You have to believe in yourself, even when no one else does." One of the athletes, a tall boy with curly hair, raised his hand hesitantly. "But what if things don't go the way you plan? What if you fail?" Chris smiled, appreciating the honesty in the question. "You're going to fail," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "That's just part of life. But failure doesn't define you. It's what you do after you fail that counts. Do you give up? Or do you get back up and keep pushing? That's the difference between success and defeat." The boy nodded, still processing Chris's words. Another athlete, a girl with braids and a fierce expression, spoke up. "But what about when the world seems like it's against you? How do you keep going?" Chris paused, feeling the weight of her question. He knew exactly what she was talking about. He had lived that reality not long ago. "You fight," he said simply. "You fight because you know that your worth isn't determined by anyone else. It's not about proving them wrong, it's about proving to yourself that you're stronger than whatever is in front of you. And trust me, you are." The girl nodded, her expression softening just a little. For the next hour, Chris talked with the group, answering their questions, running drills with them, and sharing the wisdom he had gained through his own journey. He could see the impact his words were having, not just in their expressions, but in the way they moved, the way they approached each challenge on the track with a little more confidence, a little more fire. As the session came to an end, Coach Robert clapped his hands. "All right, that's enough for today. Let's give Chris a round of applause for taking the time to come out here." The athletes erupted into applause, some of them even coming up to Chris to shake his hand, thanking him for his advice. Chris smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. This, being able to inspire others to give back, was just as important to him as any race. After the session, Chris and Robert walked off the track together, the sun beginning to set behind them. "You've come a long way, Chris," Robert said, his voice full of pride. "I always knew you had it in you, but what you've done, it's bigger than anything I could have imagined." Chris glanced over at his coach, gratitude filling his chest. "I couldn't have done it without you, Coach. You pushed me when I needed it most." Robert smiled, shaking his head. "All I did was show you the path. You're the one who ran it." Chris laughed, appreciating the metaphor. As they reached the edge of the field, Chris spotted Maya waiting for him by the gate, her face lighting up when she saw him. She waved, and Chris felt a familiar warmth in his chest. "You're lucky, you know," Robert said, nodding toward Maya. "You've got people in your corner." Chris nodded, his smile widening. "Yeah, I am. And I'm going to keep fighting, for them, for everyone." Robert clapped him on the back before walking away, leaving Chris to join Maya. As they walked home together, Chris felt the future stretching out in front of him, full of possibilities. The fight for justice wasn't over, and the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, Chris felt ready. Ready to run his race. Ready to keep fighting. And ready to lead others along the way.
If you like this story, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on the next stories that will be posted soon. Thanks for watching, folks. See you on the next video.